Hello, Podcast Collective Consciousness. I hope all is well in your world. This is the Reconsider Simon podcast. In this audio space, I'll explore consciousness, ufology, high strangeness, the esoteric, spirituality, even the very essence of reality itself. Episode number 8. Todmorden, West Yorkshire, Stoodley Pike, UFO Alley, High Strangeness. Hello, welcome. Reconsider Simon here. In today's episode, I'm going to be discussing the town of Todmorden. Now, where is Todmorden? Well, Todmorden is in West Yorkshire. Yorkshire used to be a very large county in the United Kingdom. If you're looking at the entire map of Britain, the island itself, Yorkshire can seem like it's in the middle, but it's at the top end of England. It's in the north of England. And Yorkshire itself doesn't really exist anymore. It's been split up into smaller administrations. So you get East Yorkshire, you get South Yorkshire, North Yorkshire, and Todmorden is in West Yorkshire. And it's this town, Todmorden, is known for its high strange. There's a lot of activities been going on there for numerous decades now. In terms of the context, it's set deep within a valley. And there's surrounding moors around it. There's hilly landscape around, lots of sheep farming. In the wintertime, it can be quite bleak. I visited there and it was quite bleak, quite windy, a lot of rain, a lot of wind. But it's still very, very beautiful. Around the town of Todmorden, it's still very much a very rural place and is known for its ancient druid sites that are scattered across the landscape. And because of that, there's an intersection of ley lines that go through this area as well, hence some of the high strangeness. And there's also a lot of activity in terms of witches we're going to be talking about, animal mutilations, Masonic activity, Masonic architecture. Freemasons are there as well. And it generally is a very creative place. It's well known for being quite alternative in terms of the people that live there. You get a lot of artists living there. So as you find with many places with these types of energies, it's a drawing of quite alternative people there. And as a result of that, a lot of strange activity goes on in the skies, on the land. You know the score. Todmorden as a whole is a relatively small town. And I was brought up only a few hours away. I've never actually even heard of the town until a few years ago, particularly just because of the high strangeness. That's what kind of drew me to this place, and actually visited it as well to see if I had my own experiences. I didn't, but it was still a really nice place to visit. But this small town was actually thrust, interestingly, onto the world stage in the 1980s due to extensive UFO activity, namely a few incidents with a discovery of a retired miner who actually died, and also the confirmation from around about 3 police officers of having their own UFO experiences, and then at a later date discovering they'd actually been abducted during that experience as well. And this was thrust onto the main stage and reported by mainstream media and newspapers and television across the world. So it's quite a big story for the time. I was too young to remember any of this, so I wasn't aware of this story at all until I started to research it. Then I became aware. But because of this, varied activity with UFOs, overall Todmorden and other areas of Yorkshire is known as UFO Alley, just because of the huge uptick in UFO activity that's happened over these last few decades. But not just the UFOs as well, but just general high strangeness is a real hotspot for very strange activities. But going back to my own awareness of this town, Todmorden, I first became aware from a Telegram site. Telegram, the app that you can get on your phone or you can get on the internet. It's perceived as being this real hotbed of free speech, so you get a lot of conspiracy stuff on there, and there's some quite interesting Telegram channels that I follow. It was really, really popular during the lockdown period. I think the popularity, it's kind of waned a little bit. But there was a particular Telegram site that I joined called UFO Alley that first made me aware of Todmorden as a town. And the individual who set up this Telegram site is called David Griffin. Now, he's a really interesting chap, and was actually well known for being a researcher into the areas of the Falklands War, which is obviously the war between the United Kingdom in Argentina, or over the Falkland Islands. In Argentina, they call it something different. I did go to Argentina a few years ago, and they call it Las Malvidas, I think. Apologies to any Argentinians listening out there. But yeah, so David Griffin was doing a lot of research to do with the real reasons he thinks the Falklands War happened. And it wasn't down to the islands, it was down to something called black goo. It's a really fantastical story. You can probably find some stuff on the internet if you go through the bases YouTube channel or Rumble. A guy called Miles Johnson. He's got a lot of videos to do with David Griffin posted on his various video streaming platforms. And yeah, it goes into the Falklands War, black goo, and a British telecommunications company was involved called Marconi. And there was this strange series of deaths which happened with some of the employees of Marconi. And the idea is that this black goo, this kind of weird sentient fluid, had been found on the Falklands Islands, and it was up to this company. It seemed to be able to be programmed. They could communicate with it, had a consciousness. And this company were involved in research to do with this weird black goo. So yeah, a lot of I mean, it sounds really out there. It's really fascinating stuff. And David Griffin was I think, the pioneer of this level of research. And so yeah, check out his stuff. But the company as a whole, Marconi, now doesn't really exist anymore. It's been fragmented up and absorbed into British Aerospace, BAE Systems, Ericsson. Yeah, so it's been sort of absorbed into the other larger corporations. But David as well, I think he's quite into CE5, which is the Dr. Stephen Greer, contact protocols. If you want to be able to try and meditate in remote view, and you can try and call in lights in the skies, UFO activity. So he's quite into that as well. So, but yeah, he can be found on Telegram, but a really interesting guy. So this is the reason why I became first aware of Todmorden, because I think he lives in Todmorden, or he's kind of quite close to there. And there's a whole community of people who are quite into UFO research and aliens and general conspiratorial matters. I think there are monthly meetups in a pub called the Golden Lion, and people exchange stories and experiences to do with UFOs and maybe abduction as well. But it's not just UFOs. I think there's an active community of people just generally looking to high strangeness, and also kind of ley line hunters as well. So there's a real community of people there researching and discussing their ideas, and they meet quite regularly. And I think this Telegram channel is an offshoot of that. So that's how I became first aware of Todmorden. On that Telegram channel, the UFO Alley channel, I'm not hugely active in terms of like adding comments or anything. I tend to just read what people say, and they have quite a high level of education in terms of like high strangeness and all things conspiratorial. So it's always quite interesting to kind of dip in every now and again when, certain situations happen in the world and see what their take is. So I can tend to be more of a voyeur rather than a participant. But the actual cover image for the Telegram channel itself is this huge obelisk, which is actually situated in Todmorden. So it's a huge beacon. It's very defining architecture for the town itself. So generally my interest really was piqued a few years ago, at least a couple of years ago. I decided to drive there when I was visiting up north, visiting my parents. I thought I'd go for a walk around the area, see what I could see. So yeah, I sort of drove there, and I gravitated towards the Pike, this huge kind of obelisk that is situated right on the edge of one of the big hills, one of the moors that overlooks the town. So I parked my car, walked to the top, had it was a nice day, I think, at the time, a little bit windy, a little bit of rain, nice brisk walk on a Sunday, I remember. And I just walked around the area, kind of walked down to a reservoir, through a little bit of forestry area. And but I didn't experience anything really energetic or high strangeness at the time. I was only there for a few hours. But it was just a generally nice stroll, nice walk for the day. There seems to be quite a thing that's, coming up for me at the moment is obelisks. And, I mentioned on the last podcast, I was talking about the Duke of Westminster and his stately land, which is right next to the River Dee. It's vast as I walked, really beautiful area. And he has a huge obelisk, and it's a massive straight driveway, very deadly straight driveway that takes you to the main hall or the house, the big mansion building. And there's a huge obelisk right, I think it's about halfway down. And on that same walk, I spotted another obelisk in the distance. And yeah, so there's this obelisks are coming up a lot from it in the moment, and they are generally all over the world. And I think, when I wasn't really into this sort of stuff, you kind of casually like, oh yeah, there's a big needle looking stone built piece of architecture, and you didn't really think much of it. But if you really think about it, it's like, why the hell are they there? What are they for? They always have some kind of interesting cover story, like it's a war memorial, or it's a memorial confirming peace, wanting world peace. All these kind of stories, but it's just a lot of the time they're built by very wealthy benefactors as well. So yeah, there's always a very much kind of rich person behind their construction. Um, there can be various different heights. Some can be, humongous, really tall, always obviously pointing up to the sky. And they tend to be a lot of the time in areas of quite, maybe energetic, but also power centers as well. London has one, the Vatican has one, Washington, DC has one. Again, I always have to bring Avebury into the conversation in Wiltshire, it seems, but there's a massive one there, very similar to this one that's in Todmorden. It's called the Lansdowne Monument, and it's outside Cherwell, and it's in Wiltshire. It's probably 20 minutes, half an hour from Avebury, and obviously Avebury being a very energetic place as well. And literally a few days ago, I was driving from the north down to the south, down to the Brighton area again, and there's a junction that changed. The M40 motorway changes in the M42, I think. And that's around about near Birmingham. And as I was driving there, it's just a huge field to the left of where I was driving on the motorway. And there was just random massive obelisk right in the field. And just before, writing this podcast, I actually just did a little bit of research in terms of like, which is this, where does this come from? What is this obelisk? And I managed to track it down. And it's specifically where the address of it is in Solihull, which is in Warwickshire. And this is kind of in the middle of the country. In Birmingham. Birmingham is kind of a major city, major urban area in the United Kingdom. It's called the Midlands. And yeah, that particular obelisk is called the Umberslade obelisk and was constructed in 1749 by the first Baron Thomas Archer. And he owned the local mansion called the Umberslade Hall. And a little bit of information that apparently a historian called William Hutton in 1905 wrote, Lord Archer's monument of nothing in particular. I mean, really, is that true? And we just built a monument for no particular reason. And so it's another example of quite a wealthy individual just building this random obelisk. And it's essentially in a field. It's not close to anything. I think there was a village I saw on the map that was close by, and it's nearby a church, and obviously this Umberslade Hall. I didn't see that on the map, but it's just very random. And, the Todmorden obelisk is as strange. It's called Stoodley Pike. I'm not sure if I actually said the name yet, but it's called Stoodley Pike. I hope I'm saying that correctly. But in a moment, I'm going to go more into Stoodley Pike, the architecture, this Masonic architecture, this needle on the top of the hill, on the top of the moor, and it overlooks the entire kind of valley that Todmorden is set within. And in Todmorden, again, it's a very alternative place. It seems to attract quite creative people, alternative thinkers, ley lines, various interesting energies within the area. In terms of like distance from major urban conurbations, it's probably about 17 miles from Manchester, Manchester being quite a large northern city. And overall, the residents at Todmorden, they just call it Todd, affectionately call it Todd, T-O-D. And roughly has a population about 16,000 people. So it's not big, it's quite a small town. Just doing a little bit of cursory research into the origins of Todmorden, its development history. I mean, in the very beginning, the actual kind of valley that nestles around with the moors around was quite inhospitable. It's quite steep-sided, quite hard to build there. A lot of the early settlements tend to actually be in the moorland area because on the top of the hills, it's quite flat. And the valley itself was quite swampy, so the typography is quite difficult to build in or walk around, etc. So yeah, generally people tended to live on the top of the moors apparently. But the whole town as a whole generally grew out of industry, and the textile industry was the first one due to I think because of the water sources that went through the valley, they were harnessing some of these streams, these powerful streams, and they had water wheels which would power mills, and obviously the mills would then help develop some of these textiles with some of the rudimentary machinery they were using at the time. And then textiles apparently then turned more into cotton, and then the transportation networks were gradually being built up back then. Train systems were kind of added in, which linked up with Manchester and other kind of great northern towns. And then you have this whole canal system that crisscrosses a lot of the United Kingdom as well. And it's part of Todmorden is part of the Rochdale Canal. So these are completely artificial canals that were built. They're not natural rivers or streams that have been modified. They were built for the purpose of moving goods essentially during the Industrial Revolution. And so all of this industrial activity really firmly established the town. But in terms of early settlers of the area, civilization, I mean, it probably stretches back a long, long way. There's a lot of megalithic activity there. You have barrows there, you have cairns, stone circles, and as a result of that, obviously this area is always been to a point quite energetic with the ley lines. It's attracted a lot of high strange, a lot of activity, interesting activity. I mentioned before about witches and this being part of Todmorden's history, occult history. And due to the energetic aspect of this land, it obviously has quite a lot of historical context and occult activity. And I found this interesting website. It's called Arcus Atlantis. And there's a page on there. I'm going to put all these links, everything I'm talking about, in the description so you'll be able to kind of follow that way. But it has a thing called the Lancashire witch trials, which happened in the 17th century. And it has a record for 1638. And in Todmorden, a coven of witches was uncovered. People were called witches for a variety of reasons. It could be because they were herbalists, or they did alternative healing, or they had a cat. So it could be quite crazy reasons why people were called a witch. And obviously they were burnt at the stake or killed in some horrific way. And they could just be a nice person who just wanted to try and heal people, and they had more pagan Wiccan beliefs, and they were perceived as being evil. I'm not to say there wasn't people maybe doing quite evil, dark stuff, but obviously you understand a lot of this witch trial stuff doesn't mean that these particular witches were bad or had malintent towards people. But and then again, we don't know. Anyway, but in this particular record in 1638 of this Todmorden coven that was found, and it was 27th of March of that year, these witches were presented to Sir George Vernon and Sir Robert Berkeley, and some were convicted because apparently they caused around 7 various deaths within the community. So hence why some of them were charged for being witches. And so it just goes to show how far back some potential occult activity maybe goes back to. So that details a little bit of witch activity within that area. And I'm going to return back to that because some really interesting information to do with witches' covens and ley lines. And there's an interesting theory that I've read which has really piqued my interest. In terms I mentioned before about this idea of having negative or positive ley lines, and why potentially ley line might be causing ill health, or negative it may be causing negative things to happen within the landscape or within human bodies. And I'm always interested, like, why does that happen? And there's just an interesting theory to do with like occult magic and witches, which I found very fascinating, which I'll come back to. So Stoodley Pike, the large obelisk that sits and large looms over Todmorden on the moor, looks down on the town below, has a lot of Freemasonry activity, apparently, and Masonic reasons for it being there. And in terms of, the construction, the physicality, it is a really large obelisk to the point where there's actually a door where you can probably enter in. There's an internal staircase, which then takes you to a balcony, which spans the perimeter of the obelisk. And overall, the whole obelisk itself is about 37 meters tall, or 121 feet in old money. And was designed by local architect John Green, and was apparently started in 1814 and was completed in 1815. And the mainstream historical account of why it was constructed was to commemorate the defeat of Napoleon and the defeat of Paris. Whether this is true or not, I would beg to question that. But that is the story you kind of read on various blogs and on Wikipedia. So it's very large. Overall, a lot of the obelisks I've come across tend to be just, purely a stone monument, maybe with a plaque on there, maybe with some hieroglyphics, something like that. I've never come close to one where it's actually like a building because it has a doorway, it has an internal staircase, and it's something that's inhabitable, and it has a balcony that wraps around the monument itself as well. And it's just all strange. Why would you construct and put all these aspects in? Because the general public, they're not allowed access into it, and I don't think they ever have. So it's just strange that all of these things have been built into this monument. I came across this article on a website called the Northern Antiquarian, and the article was just simply called Stoodley Pipe Circle, Mankin Holes, West Yorkshire. And I think Mankin Holes is sort of a town nearby, I think. Anyway, in this blog, it talks about how before that obelisk was there, how before Stoodley Pike as a building was there, it was originally a cairn. So there was something, a megalithic structure was there before. And it either was destroyed or disintegrated over the period of time if it was there for various hundreds of years, just naturally. It is a very exposed place as well. There's a lot of wind and rain there. So, buildings in general are going to be quite weather beaten. And in this blog and other areas, a lot of people speculate this area being a place of ceremony because burial bones have been found there. And according to this blog as well, there's a lot of local gossip that people have witnessed Freemasonic ritual activity around that building. And yeah, this just kind of makes sense why they would put a sealed doorway, staircases in there, and a balcony. It could be part of this ritualistic ceremony that they're involved in. And within this article, it pulls out a quote from a 1974 book written by E.M. Savage. In this book, apparently he quotes a local poet and writer called William Law, who's quoted as saying, "Rude heap of stones stood since time immemorial." So goes to show there was something there before the pike itself. And he mentions a potential meeting place for Good Granny. Good as in Gude. I don't know what that means, but apparently these grannies or Good Grannies, whatever they are, I don't know what different type of granny that makes you. They would meet there to tell stories. So it's been place of ceremony, place of people meeting there for a very long time. And again, it goes on to quote more of this book. It goes, another story was that the cairn marked the grave of an old chieftain and that the bones of a human skeleton had been found. Contemporary of William Law, called Holt, stated that this was so. Another story that someone had been murdered and buried there. Many years later, Law quizzed the workman. Bones had been found, but no one knew whose bones or their age, so the mystery remained. Another quote from E.M. Savage's book, it goes, yet another story had it that the occupant, presumably the owner of Stoodley, had to keep the original pike, the cairn, in neat and good order. If a single stone was out of place, no one could sleep. The banging of doors and other noises started up to remind the owner to tidy up the stones. Elusive flames were seen to be playing around the stones. So the stories went. So this points towards this cairn. It was there before this energetic place. It was before the obelisk itself. This cairn seemed to used to have lights. People used to be able to visibly see these dancing lights going around the cairn. So that's pretty interesting. I just thought, actually, if you don't know what a cairn is a collection of a pile of rocks. It's like a giant dry stone wall effect. And there's no mortar in between the stone. It's just, stones placed on top of each other. And it kind of makes a dome shape. And there are so many different forms of domes, but that's the general shape. It's like a coracle dome shape. And they tend to be placed on top of hills a lot of the time. People make modern cairns these days. People take a piece of rock up to it when they're climbing a hill or a mountain in memory of someone, and then they'll place this rock, and they'll gradually over time people are creating their own cairns. But yeah, that's a general shape of what a cairn is. There is apparently an inscription on the pike. I don't remember seeing that then when I was there, which is meant to read, Stoodley Pike, a peace monument erected by public subscription, commenced in 1814 to commemorate the surrender of Paris to the Allies and finished after the Battle of Waterloo, when peace was established. In 1815, by a strange coincidence, the pike fell on the day the Russian ambassador left London before the declaration of war with Russia in 1854, was rebuilt when peace was restored in 1856, repaired and lightning conductor fitted in 1889. So take it or leave it. I mean, all this information could be true. This is what's in the public domain in terms of the reason why that obelisk is there. It's a peace monument essentially. But as I was trying to look for the connection between this monument, this piece of architecture with, Freemasons, I came across this great article written on the Stoodley Pike, West Yorkshire blog, and it's written by a gentleman called Steve Hanson. I had access to this. Had problems loading this article. It would take quite a while. I don't know why. And now trying to revisit back to this link, I think for whatever reason his site has been hacked, so I can't seem to access anymore, which is frustrating. So I only managed to get a certain amount of notes because he actually writes a lot about some of the potential connections with Freemasonry and the structure. So yeah, it's quite annoying that I can't access it anymore, but I managed to get some of the information, so that at least counts. Steve writes, he highlights an obelisk. It's part of a trend which Alan Moore called the Great Masonic Obelisk Sitting Drive of the 19th century. So Alan Moore, I didn't know, is a comic book writer. He's written quite prolific graphic novels. And he's actually piqued my interest to read more of his material. Looks quite an interesting individual. But yeah, there obviously is a huge prevalence of obelisks that are being built over a particular period of time. So yeah, again, he highlights this. Steve then goes on to talk about the Freemasons being really obsessed by Egyptology, which is where a lot of the structural, the physicalities of these obelisks come from. They're copied from Egypt. There's some of these same structures appeared in Egypt as well. So this is just copying some of these mechanisms. But this particular obelisk in Todmorden has apparently a compass symbol, which obviously very much related to Freemasonry, on a lintel above the door. And someone also mentioned there's a Star of David logo on there as well. So yeah, some strange symbols are actually kind of embossed on this structure itself. This obelisk has an internal structure. It has a door, has stairways, has a balcony. So it's something you can enter. And then Steve in this article starts to make a connection between why this exists and Freemasonry, the secret organizations of the Freemasons. And he starts to talk about the initiation ceremony. When you become a Freemason, you have a hangman's noose placed around your neck and you're blindfolded as an individual. And the end of the rope hangs behind you. And apparently there's an individual that in a guard, he places the point of a dagger on your left breast. And it's called the baptism of fear in the presence of the great architect of the universe. And the great architect of the universe is the Masonic God. And from the mainstream point of view, when you look into Freemasonry, they always claim, you can be any religion to be a Freemason. But generally the higher power, they call it the great architect, which obviously, if you've ever watched the Matrix films, the very last film, Neo meets what's called the great architect. So there's a lot of parallels there as well. So yeah, Steve makes a connection really between this obelisk and Freemasons and ceremony. And there is already, some evidence out there for people witnessing Masonic ceremonies occurring around there. So maybe he's right. Maybe it is used as a point of initiation. Maybe these initiates are entering through this doorway and it's all dark and it's this journey, it's initiation journey, and they're walking up the stairs in the darkness, and then they're coming out onto the balconies as you coming into the light. It's you becoming a conscious being in their eyes, and no longer you're going to be hidden from the secrets of the universe. Maybe that is true. Maybe that is the reason for the existence of this structure. I mean, that's the broad cursory strokes of this article. It's again a shame that I can't access the rest of it, but that's what I can remember. So yeah, interesting data point. And then so I thought I would then navigate to that particular Telegram channel that I mentioned before to do with UFO Alley, and just put the search term in Stoodley Pike and see what will come up, see if anyone mentioned it, because they have it as the main photo of to represent the channel itself. And then various people were talking about the structure, and someone mentioned apparently in Paul Devereaux's book, Earthlight Revelations, he references a previous ancient cairn, which we spoke about before, and people would witness lights dancing and coming out of that cairn on top of the hill. But the majority of people on the channel were discussing the Masonic connection to the obelisk and the fact that the whole reason Todmorden's existence was due to rich industrialists, and they perceived them to have esoteric hobbies. So with this very exclusive set of very rich individuals that are creating all this industry within Todmorden and across the United Kingdom, they had very esoteric ideas, esoteric hobbies, and they built Todmorden and they funded the pike essentially. And then one guy actually called it a UFO antenna. You know, it's actually attracting some of this UFO activity as an antenna. An excellent quote that I pulled from this Telegram channel goes like this. It goes, "It seems that there are concentrated areas worldwide where there is some kind of invisible opening, either static or in flux, which allows certain supernatural influences to freely enter and leave our plane of existence at will. It seems that there are certain societies in the upper echelons that have knowledge of these special zones and actively seek to harness the influence or energy in them by building over them and or marking them for their own purposes." I would very much agree with that comment. I feel that definitely a lot of these structures have very, very wealthy funders behind them. They're being built in very key strategic places. Again, everyday individuals just kind of walk past these monuments without giving a second thought. But I think there's a very deep esoteric meaning behind them and a very deep mechanism behind them as well. So yeah, this is an interesting thread of research. I'm going to continue looking into it more. Another article I want to highlight comes from a website called Biblioteca Pleiades. This is a huge resource of information of conspiracies and high strangeness, other stuff. And then the particular article that I'm going to talk about is actually written by a guy called Patrick Mark Gibbons. It was originally hosted on a different website called Project Prove, which doesn't seem to work anymore. It seems defunct. But yeah, this article remains on Biblioteca Pleiades. And the reason it piqued my interest because specifically he talks about ley lines, and I've been pondering and discussing a lot, why do ley lines, why are they some of them positive, why are they some of them negative? We can discuss some of the ideas, you have male and female expressions for various reasons of ley lines, but there's also another side, it being maybe detrimental to the landscape around or detrimental to the human health, or opposite, it could be really beneficial to the area around and obviously really healing to the human body. But Mark Patrick Gibbons, I've heard of his name before, but yeah, I can't really point towards any of his research previously. But yeah, definitely have heard the name. Turns out he's a researcher of UFOs, and he seems to actually live in Todmorden. I did a little bit of research on him, and I could sort of find his Twitter channel, and I found him on Instagram, and he seems to actually be, resident within Todmorden itself. But he theorizes that the ley lines go rogue or they can be manipulated to be negative. And in his opinion, this is down to black magic. And he references in the article some evidence to do with a negative coven of witches who would meet up in the 1970s in Todmorden, and they would practice their craft in a small woodland area in a district called Cornholme. According to him, this area has 4 ley lines that run through it in various directions. And it was after that the coven stopped practicing that wildlife completely disappeared in that area. And again, it is his opinion, this is when the real high strangers started to occur due to these ceremonies, due to this intent, this malintent kind of changing the energy of the landscape. And it was only after a series of white witches went in there and cleared the area and then flipped the energy in a way from a negative to a more positive that the wildlife, according to him, started to return in the mid-1990s. He further references this idea of the occult and black magic being used to change the energy of ley lines in a malintent, in a negative way. He starts to speak about an author called Andy Collins, who I'd never heard of before, but having researched his face, I do recognize him. He speaks and he writes on a broad breadth of different subjects. But he wrote a book, quite a famous book called The Black Alchemist. And he claims within this book that there are groups of people going around specifically hexing ley lines around the UK, blackening them, as he calls it. He goes on to make a very intense connection between some of this occult blackening of some of these ley lines and the ceremonies that have been done to the famous hurricane winds of 1987. Um, Generally, the UK doesn't get hurricane strength winds, but on this particular occasion, we had this thing called the Great Storm of 1987, where you had 100-mile-an-hour winds and around 18 people died across the country. And it devastated huge area, well, not huge areas, but it devastated many areas across the country. They're really destructive winds. And rather famously at the time, there was a TV weatherman called Michael Fish, and the day before, he claimed that a hurricane wouldn't happen. That would never happen in the UK, and obviously, he was completely proven wrong. But yeah, anyway, there seems to be a connection, according to this guy, between some of this occult activity and these hurricane winds, which were really, really unusual. They came out of nowhere. So maybe there is something to that. But there is a real, like, tangible connection between, ceremony, human intent in co-creating the weather, maybe having a relationship, what they called elementals and native tribes across the world have been very, very well versed in these ideas of how to, call in rain, how to call in sunshine. They're a lot more attuned to the natural environment. And they have these ceremonies, they have these techniques that allow them to do that, to allow to what they would call co-create the weather, not manipulate, but co-create. And there is even stories that I've heard. I was listening to a podcast not that long ago, and the Dalai Lama, I'm not even sure if it's the current one or a different one, would actually, before he would visit somewhere, he would send a specific person, maybe a week or two beforehand, to, co-create the weather to be good. So when he visited there, that the weather would be good for his visit. So, people who wanted to maybe go and hear him speak or interact with him, it wouldn't be impeded by the weather. Like, the weather would be really good. And that, it's fascinating that they had a particular individual, like I don't you call him a magician and weather magician, doing this. So yeah, there's a lot of precedent for this in ancient cultures already. But I mean, I'm quoting here ideas of tribes and ancient peoples co-creating the weather for benefit, for maybe irrigating crops or having sunshine to help the growth of agriculture. But what is detailed here in terms of the occult black magic is something very different to that. It's something very malevolent, quite evil, like potentially conjuring hurricane winds in an area which just doesn't get it, usually. So after reading about this book called The Black Alchemist, I mean, this just spurred on a whole new like level of interest in terms of like ley lines and that particular story, because there's a lot of, well, it's a huge link to Sussex, where I was before in the South Downs. And because apparently within this book, it documents the story of the author and a psychic looking for a particular Egyptian treasure. And while they're in the midst of this adventure trying to find this Egyptian treasure, they came across this ritualistic dark occult item in a church near the South Downs, near the Long Man of Wilmington. And this is a church. This is a church I've mentioned in a previous podcast. I've spoken about the Long Man of Wilmington. This is in the South Downs on the South Downs Hill, and there's this chalk figure that's been etched into the side of the landscape, and he's holding two staves either side. And a lot of people think this is an early dogman, like a dowser, and this is what this kind of iconography relates to. But anyway, yeah, there's not too far away from this Long Man of Wilmington. There's a few churches that are supposed to be quite energetic, and this relates to this story within the Black Alchemist. So the author and this psyker then go on to discover there's a group of people or a core individual going around blackening ley lines, hexing ley lines, using ceremony, going to energetic areas, doing these ceremonies because they want to help create the Antichrist, which is a wild connection. I never thought, like, I started to do a bit of cursory read and they would start to talk about how Sussex is a real hotbed of occult activity. And, conjuring the Antichrist, I just can't get my head around why people would want to do that. This brings into sharp focus the Israel-Palestine conflicts at the moment, and this idea that some people want to create the Antichrist, or depending on what religious view you're taking, people say it's to conjure up the Antichrist or to conjure the second coming of Christ by sacrificing this red heifer and building this temple on this mound, to all fulfilling these prophecies. And again, I just can't understand why people want to do these ceremonies to elicit the Antichrist. Why would you want to do that? But people are, unfortunately. And it's just wild that, a county that I was living in, Sussex, people are trying to do exactly the same thing. So I'm avidly quite interested to read this book further. It sounds wild, some of the connections. And I've never heard this story before. And apparently it's quite a well-known one as well. Anyway, that was a slight detour, sort of focusing our attention back on Yorkshire again and what Mark Patrick Gibbons has written. But he started to talk about how he collected a lot of data to do with UFO sightings and abduction experiences. And he started to see a real correlation between some of these situations and ley lines. And he defines basically between areas of Scammondon, I think it is, Todmorden and Ilkley. He published his findings at the time in a magazine called UFO Encounters. I'm not sure when, or I tried to find this article, I can't find it anywhere. But he coined the term the Yorkshire Triangle. So he saw this real correlation between UFOs and abduction experiences, and it was very much within this triangle shaped area on the map. Now, bringing in the conversation to do with negative ley lines, he also noticed that abduction experiences with negative beings, such as like the typical grey aliens, or like maybe having spirit-led encounters or poltergeist activity, which can be quite scary. He perceived these activities actually happening on negative ley lines, blackened ley lines that have been created through these occult practices. And he defined these ley lines as being negative due to, again, occult activity that had happened around these ley lines, and talking to people who had seen some of these ceremonies and seen some of these things being carried out to make these areas negative. On the opposite side of the coin, he talks about, positive or healthy ley lines. And actually, those experiences people would have in those areas would be very different. And they would have very positive UFO experiences. And they would be seeing very sort of benevolent, sort of seeing strange earth lights that he would describe. And these are quite calming, quite etheric energies, and very, very like good. And so completely opposite side of the coin to the more negative ley lines. It's Mark's opinion that actually ley lines are created through tectonic plate activity. It's the actual fault lines, the magnetic energy emanating from these fault lines create these ley lines. And then he starts again to speak about Paul Devereaux and some of his research, who claims that earth lights are released before small earthquakes. This is why people see strange lights in the sky sometimes, because of minimal earthquake activity, and these lights are kind of emanating from the Earth's crust itself. He also had a very interesting take on, why ghosts or apparitions happen, potentially when people endure violent deaths or something quite violent on key energetic points, like a ley line. These ley lines can end up recording that activity and up replaying those events, further down the line, decades, maybe hundreds of years down the line, because that violent activity is like a node point which has been recorded energetically and just plays out every now and again. But his analogy for negative and positive ley lines is you might have positive people, and positive people attract other positive people. But if you're really, really negative, you're attracting more negativity that you're emitting as well. And it's the same as in his opinion that ley lines act the same way. So you get positive ley lines which attract positive activity, and negative ley lines which attract negative activity. But again, this article really resonated with me. Made a lot of sense. I mean, I'm not completely sold on it. Obviously, again, be skeptical of things, hold these ideas in your mind, and then see what else comes down the line in terms of evidence. But I thought it was a really good theory in terms of some of these negative A lines being affected potentially by occult practices, and this is why you might get areas where negative stuff actually happens. And the timelines, they all match up, because you have these 1970s witches, negative witches, meeting in ceremony blackening the ley lines. And it's really during the 1980s, early 80s, that stuff really starts to kick in. And this is when, starts to put Todmorden on the map. There's one particular story, or a couple of particular stories that really put Todmorden on the global stage. So as we move on to these two stories, they involve two main individuals. A guy called Alan Godfrey, who is a PC, who's a police officer, and also an individual called Zygmunt Adamski, who died, unfortunately. And yeah, the story involves potential alien abduction, UFO sightings, and then this has elicited a whole load of like global news that spread around the world. Documentaries have been made about these stories. Even mainstream news were reporting this in terms of newspapers and television news as well. So it was a big story at the time. I wasn't aware of it because I was too young. But the very start of it happens in 1980 with coal miner Zygmunt Adamski, who originally I think was Polish. And he left home in Tingley, which is in West Yorkshire, to go shopping, but unfortunately never returned. And eventually his dead body was found 10 feet high on top of a pile of coal in Todmorden, 20 miles away from his home. So it's already strange. He left home on foot to go shopping and ended up dead 10 feet high on a pile of coal in Todmorden. So yeah, very strange. His dead body was discovered by a local policeman who's the Alan Godfrey character. And the person who died, Adamski, was actually wearing a suit. Apparently his watch was missing. His wallet was missing. His hair, very strangely, had been roughly cut. He had apparently 1 day's beard growth, but had been missing for several days, so that didn't make sense. Also on his skin, he had these strange burn marks on his neck, on his head and his shoulders. And the coroner actually confirmed that on the burns, there was a very strange ointment that had been applied. And they couldn't identify any of the ingredients in the ointment itself. It didn't make any sense through chemistry. They couldn't confirm any of the materials used at all. So this death sets the scene for the next aspect of the story. 5 months later, after the Adamski death, now PC Godfrey, the original policeman who discovered the body, he becomes the story. He's on duty really early in the morning. And he gets a call to go and check out some escaped cattle, some cows that obviously run away from a field somehow. It was during the process of driving to try and find these cattle, he actually had this really powerful UFO experience. In the sky, he saw this bright, bright light in the sky. He described it as a rotating diamond-shaped vessel that was 24 feet high and 400 feet wide. He even made a sketch of it in his notebook when he was actually, experiencing this. He tried to radio through to the police headquarters, but he discovered that the actual radio was dead. The energy in the air just disabled all electronic function in his radio. Then suddenly he experienced this bright flash. It disappeared, and he found himself 30 yards or 30 meters down the road. And he actually had missing time as well of around 25 minutes. And even more strangely, he found that his boots, his shoes had been split open, and he had this very strange red itchy mark on his foot. Because it was such a powerful, real experience, he had real close-up detail of this UFO, he had missing time. He told the truth, he told his superiors, he told the rest of the force of what happened to him. But unfortunately, he was met with real suspicion and even ridiculed by the rest of the police force. Eventually, the details of the story, for some reason, were leaked to newspapers. And what actually happened was what they claim was a man from the ministry, maybe MI5, visited the Yorkshire Constabulary to interview Godfrey himself. And he had to swear on the Official Secrets Act to keep everything, secret from everyone. Apparently, Godfrey reluctantly agreed to this. I don't understand how he's signed the Official Secrets Act, but now we still talk about the story. There's that bit of the evidence I don't quite understand, but whatever. But apparently, this man from the ministry, the same man, was started to follow him round. And he would be in the pub, and the same guy would be there as well. In the end, Godfrey confronted him because he felt like this guy was trying to threaten him, trying to intimidate him to not to speak. So Godfrey confronted him, told him to go away, and eventually he did disappear. But yeah, very strange. Because Godfrey had such a powerful, visceral experience, it was really obvious what had happened. There was no vagueness in his mind, but he was treated incredibly harshly by his colleagues, by the rest of the police force. Eventually, he was reassigned to a completely different area, different office, specifically due to the negative publicity and the impact that had. He stuck to his guns, he stuck to his story. Eventually, apparently, his story was confirmed by two other policemen and a bus driver in Halifax, which is nearby to Todmorden itself, who had a very similar experience on exactly the same day. So that, confirmed what he'd experienced. And plus, again, two policemen, so they're in a position of power, a position of trust and authority. So again, why would they lie? Because the pushback would be quite great. He's very brave at the time to come out and talk about this story very, very openly. I mean, this is the 1980s, so, in terms of like UFO activities, not really in the public consciousness like it is now. Maybe it's slightly more acceptable to talk about these experiences. But back then it was, incredibly strange to have it splashed across the global news, so that's quite a credit to him. He was incredibly reluctant, but eventually Godfrey was convinced by a friend to maybe undergo regression by hypnotist to try and find out more details. Being very much within the police force, he's very reluctant to this idea. He reluctantly agreed to this. The way they set it up, apparently the hypnotist who did the hypnosis didn't know any of the details or PC Godfrey, what he'd been through. All they knew that he'd been through a certain event on a certain date and a certain time, and they were trying to uncover some of these details. But it was through the process of this regression that they found out that PC Godfrey had actually been taken on board a craft. So he'd had the experience of seeing the UFO in the sky, but then he was zipped out of space-time in some way, taken aboard the craft, and examined by several small beings and a humanoid that was taller, which he described as actually having a beard. So yeah, there was loads more to the story. Obviously, mainstream opinions probably not going to take any of these details on board, but yeah, fascinating. This experience just really reinforces that you have these beings that have such advanced technology in terms of propulsion, but also they're handling a space-time. They're able to manipulate time, manipulate human consciousness, so they just forget. And then that's why they have all this missing time, and it's only through regression that they can start to garner some of these details back into their consciousness. But yeah, just fascinating details. But in terms of how Godfrey feels about this experience, he views it as being quite negative. He's quite willing, it seems, to sort of tell the truth and talk about the details, but it hasn't been a positive benefit to his life. I mean, he experienced global ridicule potentially. It really affected his career. He was quoted as saying, "I wish I'd never seen the UFO, particularly because of the effects on my children." So there's a whole family obviously affected by this experience. And he goes on to say, "It's not easy having a policeman as a father, but when he's a policeman who saw a UFO, it's even worse." So yeah, definitely wasn't a great ride for him experiencing this. Really brave of him to carry on talking about it, obviously just due to the kickback, due to the ridicule that he experienced from his workplace, but also globally as well. So it's quite intense. So it does appear now, since the 1980s, that Todmorden and other parts of West Yorkshire have become this real UFO hotspot. And people have been reporting objects in the sky now for over about 40 years across the Pennines. And, is it that something has genuinely changed the land, blackened the ley lines, like Mark Patrick Gibbons was talking about through these occult practices? Or, are people more emboldened to report these incidents because there's been sightings in the sky, so people are more aware to sort of see stuff in the sky, and this is why you have this huge uptick in reports of UFOs and experiences? Or are people just getting carried away? Maybe they're reporting, aircraft or satellites. Maybe that's happening. Or is it a combination of all of those things? Who knows? But it does seem definitely that there's a lot of genuine experiences people are having there, and it's down to the energy of the land, the architecture of the land, and Stoodley Pike maybe is playing like a part in this whole process. You never know. So another rather negative aspect to some of these energetic areas that we've had, the negative UFO experience, the negative abduction experience. There are people that talk about animal mutilations, and this happens across the globe. It's not, just in Todmorden, and Todmorden definitely you're getting evidence for animal mutilation. And a lot of the time you can rule out animal activity because if an animal was attacking some livestock, like a cow or a calf, it would be very messy. There'd be tear marks in the skin, there'd be blood everywhere, it'd be a mess. And a lot of these animals, these dead animals, they have surgical cuts on their body. So part of their mouths have been taken away, sections of their behinds have been taken away, their tails have been surgically removed. So very, very precise. So you can kind of really rule out any animal. And then some people have theories about, what is causing this. Maybe this is military or covert operations trying to make it look like aliens doing it to create that fear factor. Or is it the same aliens or ETs who potentially killed this coal miner back in the early 80s, maybe performing, experimentation on some of these livestock? Is it actually a genuine ET experience? And unfortunately, these cattle are being harvested for genetic material, maybe. Or maybe it is purely for food reasons. Maybe it's part of their diet. I mean, who knows? But again, there's a real link between animal mutilations and areas of high strangeness. And there's a lot of evidence for mutilations occurring within Todmorden and the surrounding areas. And there's a researcher called Deborah Hatswell who I've been aware of for a while. I haven't really deep dived on a lot of her stuff, but she's done a lot of research to do with cryptids within the United Kingdom. I think she's based in somewhere in the north of England somewhere. But I discovered an article on something called the UK Wildman blogspot, and she documented some images of a calf that had been mutilated actually in the the moors surrounding Todmorden itself. And it was really outside of the context of where the cows were kept. It was in a separate field. She felt it had actually been dropped from a great height. So yeah, lots of strange details and lots of surgical cuts on the animal itself as well. So it does appear that mutilations are occurring, and I would suggest deep diving into more of the work to kind of get more of an understanding. I'll leave a description and a link in the description. So, in conclusion, Todmorden is a weird but very interesting place. Lots going on. Feels like maybe all those negative things that happened in the 80s maybe doesn't really occur so much. Although obviously I think mutilations of animals are happening, but thankfully there've been no, from what I'm aware of anyway, negative abduction experiences or deaths of people such as that miner. I mean, there's no real connection or evidence to link the death of the miner Adamski to UFOs. Some people potentially think maybe he was just scared to death due to the experience and not necessarily due to the experimentation that he might have had on the craft. But again, Mark Patrick Gibbons actually relates that experience of the death of Adamski being found in that coal pile as being on a particular ley line. So yeah, he makes a correlation between the two. I don't know Todmorden well, but it seems like a really fun alternative place to live. Really creative, lots of artists live there, alternative thinkers. So, and it feels like it's got a real fascinating community of people that's quite willing to talk about UFOs and ley lines in the open. They have these regular meetups at the Golden Lion pub. Just a big takeaway for me on this subject has been the idea of cult magic and its interaction with ley lines. I think that's quite a believable theory. So, yeah, quite interested to read more into it. And, I always end up bringing Skinwalker Ranch into things like Avebury. I don't know why. I guess because they're such big stories. But yeah, I have heard a story about Skinwalker Ranch, 'cause it's a similar area, maybe even more intense. Lots of strange things happening there, UFOs, strange werewolves with burning red eyes and poltergeist activity and things. And there's that idea, like Mark Patrick Gibbons talked about, where you have these people hexing that area, putting a curse on it in a way, in having an intent to sort of change the energy in a negative way. And I had heard this theory that actually the high strange in Skinwalker Ranch was created by the Native Americans because they'd been captured and imprisoned by early European settlers. And obviously they weren't very happy about that. And so while they're in captivity, these native Indians actually cursed the area and the people that had done that to them. And this is what's created this huge array of high strangeness that happened due to that malintent, that curse that these Native Americans put on their area due to the fact that they'd been imprisoned and thrown off their lands and I mean, Skinwalker anyway, that's like they claim as an entity that can kind of move between realms and taking shape shift. So it actually comes from a Native American folklore anyway. So there's a common thread between the witches' coven story of them blacking the ley lines in Todmorden and potentially the Skinwalker Ranch area as well, with these Native Americans cursing the European settlers that had imprisoned them and wiped them off the land. Again, there's obviously hundreds of different theories to why Skinwalker Ranch exists as it is, but it's just one idea, and it's an interesting one. Admittedly, I can't find any other evidence to back up Mark Patrick Gibbons' claims that he had this negative coven of witches blacking the ley lines. I searched high and low, various search engines trying to find some blog or maybe book extract that carried more of this information, but I can't find it. So not discounting it, but just putting that out there really. But there does appear to be a lot of Freemasonic activity there. Maybe even it turns out that Todmorden was funded or built by Freemasons themselves. I mean, these were rich industrialists with a lot of money, and as we spoke about through the Telegram channel, some of the people discussing there, that they had very occult belief systems garnered from being in the Freemasons. And don't forget, being a Freemason, its very core is very much a networking group, brotherhood, where people are trying to elevate each other in commerce, in business, to succeed and to earn money. That's at the core of it. As you work your way up the levels, you're uncovering more and more occult hidden knowledge. So, I mean, this obelisk, Stoodley Pike, it definitely has Masonic symbolism on it. So there's definitely a connection there. And there is evidence of people maybe having witnessed ceremonies occurring around the area as well. And the very location of the obelisk, and it obviously replaced this cairn. It has loads of stories of dancing lights and being a place of ceremony with like ceremonial bones from potentially a chieftain that was buried there. It's an energetic point. It's a node point of energy. And it's probably been harnessed by this architecture, by this obelisk in some way, shape or form. Again, the mainstream point of view, they always create some cover story. Oh, this is a peace monument. But if you scratch the surface, there's something deeper to these structures, definitely. But I think Todmorden is only just the start. Doing a little bit of cursory research in other areas, there's just lots of sacred sites around the Yorkshire moors, lots of strange, interesting things that are happening. So at some point, I'm definitely going to do more investigations, visit these places, see what happens, and report back if I experience anything weird. But yeah, it's just really piqued my interest in that entire area. There's so much to look and see. So yeah, that's about it. I hope that piques your interest. I hope you try and maybe visit there someday. Maybe have your own experiences. You never know. But I've been Reconsider Simon. You can catch me on my website, reconsidersimon.com. I'm on all the social channels, I think. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. Just joined Substack as well. In terms of like video streaming as well, I've put myself on YouTube, on Rumble, on BitChute, on Odyssey. So you can catch me there as well. And thank you so much for joining me. And I'll catch you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.